centuries were when Christianity became a more definite and visible institution. In this lecture, I focus on the development of specifically social structures and dynamics during that same period. Despite the threat of persecution and a continuing cultural marginalization, Christianity grows during this period at a great rate, increasingly becoming an irresistible force within the empire. The responses made to the extreme forms of Christianity that I discussed in Lecture 10 revealed the presence and the power of certain figures in positions of authority, like Tertullian in North Africa and Irenaeus in Gaul, who wrote extensively against those they termed heretics. We should note that these controversies underscore the intensely literary character of Christianity. From the start, Christ believers had used writing to express their experiences and their convictions. As the movement grows, so does the size and ambition of its compositions. In this respect, Christianity continues the tradition of Judaism. Reading and writing are fundamental to this tradition. The controversies show us the mutual reading and criticism of religious compositions, the formation of networks of leaders, and the exchange of compositions as instruments in ideological conflict. As we saw in Lecture 10, the Easter controversy of the late 2nd century revealed a significant development of institutional structure. Bishops of various regions in the empire gathered in councils to debate the issues and communicated with each other through letters and the sending of delegates. In this lecture, I want to take a closer look at three dimensions of Christianity's institutional development in the 2nd and 3rd century. First, its growth in space and numbers. Second, its elaboration of worship and leadership. And third, its hierarchical structure. The first and fundamental topic is the movement's impressive growth in space and in numbers. In the 2nd and 3rd century, there is abundant evidence that Christianity expanded in terms of territory, numbers, and even social status. On the evidence of the extant literature, we know that Christianity extended itself well beyond the places attested in the New Testament. In Palestine, churches are now located both in Galilee and in Samaria. And after the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in 135, Christian bishops are again to be found in that city as well, and will continue in position there for a long time yet. In Syria, Christians moved eastward from Antioch toward Edessa, Osroene. In the 1930s, an archaeological team made up of Yale and French scholars excavated a Christian house church at the city of Dura Europos on the Euphrates River that was built before 250 and destroyed by the Parthians in the year 250. Christians also appear east of the Tigris River in Adia Bene. And some Syrian Christians also make their way to Persia. Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, had always been an area particularly populous with Christians. But we begin to find evidence of other territories within Asia with churches, and cities like Nicaea and Byzantium begin to produce literature that is Christian. In Egypt, Communities appear in the metropolis of Alexandria, as well as in towns and villages in the Upper Nile. Christianity appears in this period in the Kingdom of Ethiopia. In North Africa, Carthage and its surrounding areas had a large number of local churches. And in Europe, Christian communities are found throughout Greece, Italy, Sicily, and Spain. There are churches on the Mediterranean islands of Crete and Cyprus. Christians are attested throughout Gaul and even on the island of Britain. Such expansion across geographical space is accompanied by the production of Christian literature in new languages besides Greek and Latin. Translations of Scripture and original compositions in Syriac, Coptic, and Persian begin to appear in this period. It is certain that Christianity also grew in numbers, but the data available from antiquity makes the absolute determination of numbers mostly a matter of estimate. Despite the literary portrayal in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, which show the apostles working wonders, then preaching to the gathered crowd, then making converts, there is no real historical evidence of mass conversions to Christianity that are based on wonder-working or public preaching. Growth in numbers more likely came about through a process of social networking. Studies have shown that contemporary cults, such as that called the Unification Church, or designated by outsiders as the Moonies, tend to find converts among those who already have family members or friends in the cult. In other words, the attractiveness of a new religious movement is enhanced by finding familiar faces already within it. That paradigm seems applicable to the nascent Christian movement as well. A further factor in Christian population expansion was simple childbirth. Unlike their pagan neighbors, Christians had solid families. They did not divorce. They did not practice abortion. And they forbade child exposure. In short, they were successful in multiplying in the most obvious fashion possible through simple production of children. A reasonable chart of population growth among Christians can be based on an estimated total population in the Roman Empire of around 60 million people, and a baseline starting number for the Christian movement of about 1,000 in the year 40. On that basis, estimates can be made that around the year 50, after a period of about 10 years, there were probably about 1,400 Christians. And they were scattered in very small gatherings and associations across the Mediterranean, probably in numbers from between 20 to 50. By the year 100, it is estimated that there were probably around 7,500 Christians. By the year 150, the number of Christians could have grown to be around 40,000. And by the year 200, a huge jump to about 218,000. By the year 250, it is estimated that there could have been approximately 1,171,000 Christians. Then comes the biggest jump in numbers. During the period of tranquility that lasted roughly from the year 250 to 300, when the number of Christians grew to 6,300,000. But notice that even at this number and at that rate of expansion, Christians remained only about 10% of the total population of the empire. There are some indications as well that Christians were finding their way slowly into higher social ranks. In the years 177 to 180, the philosopher Celsus, in his attack on Christianity, called the True Word, designated the movement one of wool candlers, cobblers, and laborers, slaves, and women. In other words, it was made up of people who did not belong to the nobility, but the lowest classes. 100 years later, around the year 270, another philosophical critic of Christianity, the philosopher Porphyry, speaks of the Christian religion as including women of the nobility. And by the year 300, we can see Christians counted among magistrates, provincial governors, and even chamberlains in the imperial court. The consequences of such expansion and growth in numbers should be obvious. They made the need for greater organization more pressing. There was need for a more explicit and more elaborate authority structure at the local level to deal with larger communities, to coordinate tasks and administration. The organization of the local assembly, its meeting place and times of meeting, the order of its worship, the making of decisions, the providing of hospitality to delegates from other assemblies, the regulation of teaching, the burying of the dead, the administration of practical help to the poor, above all, orphans and widows, those who were always chronically among the dispossessed in a patriarchal society. All of this required process and oversight. But there was equally need to assure communications between and among local assemblies in order to ensure a Catholic, the term means universal, identity that spanned multiple languages and territories, as letters were sent and received, as delegates and missionaries were commissioned and supplied for their expeditions, as synods and councils were called and attended, and fellowship was expressed by the sharing of resources among communities. In response to such expansion and growth, administrative offices at the local level became at once more complex, more centralized, and more deeply infused with religious significance. In the New Testament, the leadership of local communities is only barely touched on, primarily in the letters of Paul to his delegates, Timothy and Titus. And the structure of that leadership appears to be both utterly simple and utterly secular. The structure of the local assembly in these letters of Paul resembles the basic structure of the Jewish synagogue in the diaspora, which in turn resembles the structure of Greco-Roman associations and clubs. The New Testament assigns no special religious symbolism to such administration in the local assembly. What we see is a simple board of elders, like the gerousia of the diaspora synagogue. And this board of elders has as its head a revolving position that's called superintendent or supervisor. The term episkopos, which is correctly translated as superintendent or supervisor, gets translated as bishop and of course takes on a much greater meaning as time goes by. But at this point, the superintendent or the supervisor is a rotating position within the Board of Elders, which has fundamentally simple administrative responsibilities. And under that Board of Elders with its superintendent, we see lesser functionaries called helpers. Another way to translate diakonoi, deacons or deaconesses. And these carry out the practical chores of the community. Paul's letters indicate that such local leadership was responsible for instruction, for providing hospitality, for settling disputes, and for administering community welfare, for orphans and widows in particular. But Paul assigns no specific sacral language to such leadership. Things change dramatically when we see the letters of Ignatius of Antioch around the year 107. You remember that Ignatius is the bishop of Antioch who is on his way to Rome to suffer as a martyr, who writes 7 letters to churches throughout Asia Minor. And his letters indicate that by the early part of the 2nd century, at least the communities of Syria and Asia have developed a much more complex organization with a much more elaborate rationalization of that organization. Either they have developed it or Ignatius wants to see them develop it. In his letters, the bishop is now monarchical. There is a single bishop in each community, and he is the single ruler of that community. And as legitimation, that single authority of the bishop is compared to the oneness of God. The bishop is the source of unity. Ignatius declares emphatically, there is no true Eucharist apart from the bishop. The elders, in turn, remember that board of elders, are now priests. Presbyters is a way of presbyter can be translated as priest. So the elders and the deacons are now all lower orders aligned with the single bishop and clearly subordinate to the single bishop. We find the start of a clerical order within Christianity in the proper sense. Ignatius nicely expresses the high level of symbolism that he attaches to these leadership roles. He says, be zealous to do all things in harmony with God, with the bishop presiding in the place of God, and the presbyters in the place of the council of the apostles, and the deacons who are most dear to me, entrusted with the service of Jesus Christ, who was from eternity with the Father and was made manifest at the end of time. Be united with the bishop and those who preside over you as an example and lesson of immortality. This is in Ignatius's letter to the Magnesians, the 6th chapter. A series of compositions of the 2nd and 3rd century, known as church orders, devote themselves to the regulation of the common life and show how the roles of the clergy are steadily more developed. The Didache, or teaching of the 12 apostles, comes from Syria at the end of the 1st or the start of the 2nd century. It is remarkably simple. More complex is the apostolic tradition, attributed to the leader Hippolytus, coming from Rome sometime in the late 2nd or the beginning of the 3rd century. Much more complex is the Didascalia Apostolorum, the teaching of the apostles, which originates in Syria in the 3rd century. And finally, as a grand climax, we find the 8 books of the apostolic constitutions from the 4th century, which subsumes elements of all these earlier books? What do we find in these church orders, which are really the beginning of canon law? We find that the authority of the bishop increasingly appears as supreme within the church. And the bishop is at the center of every activity, above all worship. Remarkably, we begin to see the language of the Old Testament with respect to sacrifices and high priests now being applied to these Christian leaders and their liturgical activities. Below the bishop, we find a variety of lower clerical orders: acolytes, exorcists, lectors, deacons, deaconesses, priests, widows, and this clergy is now responsible for the community activities and are specifically and sharply contrasted to the laity, those who do not belong to the clergy. Now, because our sources take the form of regulations rather than reports of real life, we are pretty much left in the dark about many things we would like to know about the ordinary life of Christians in this period. What were those who were not bishops and clergy doing? We can only guess. But on the other side, the sources do suggest a vibrant religious life in which the activities of worship and prayer are balanced by a genuine care for the poor and the needy within the community. Such local administrative structures are required, at least in part, because Christians are increasingly in a position to dispose of property, a clear sign that persecution was sporadic rather than steady over these centuries. After the year 180, we find the first examples of genuine or unmistakable Christian art in the form of biblical themes that are carved into sarcophagi, caskets. We find the story of Jonah swallowed by the whale and spewed up on the land as an image of death and resurrection. We find images of Jesus at meal with his followers or multiplying the loaves. Biblical themes. Such sculpting and accompanying inscriptions indicates a certain degree of wealth. Many of these were discovered by archaeologists in the catacombs, the underground chambers that served as places of burial, and that Christians, especially in Rome, sometimes used as places of worship. By the 3rd century, communities begin to meet in houses that are intended to be churches from the start, rather than meeting in ordinary households belonging to some wealthier member or other. An example is that house church at Dura Europos I mentioned earlier in this presentation, destroyed around the year 250 of the Common Era. In this house, which was clearly intended to be a church house, we find a separate baptistry, a place for baptism to be carried out. And we find the walls wonderfully adorned with frescoes, again depicting biblical scenes, much in the fashion that on the same street in Dura we find the Jewish synagogue adorned with frescoes, and the cult of Mithras in the Mithraeum adorned with frescoes. An example of the use of property can be found in Calixtus of Rome. He was first a deacon in charge of the funds for the support of widows. Unfortunately, he lost those funds and had to flee. Later, presumably having been restored to trust, he was put in charge of the burial chambers along the Appian Way. Still later, he became Bishop of Rome between 217 to 222. But we see how bishops were involved in administration during this time. The institutional expansion of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century included the development of regional spheres of influence. The term diocese was used in Roman language for the geographical region administered by a bishop with the help of his clergy. And it derived, as does the term episkopos, bishop itself, from Greek political usage. The term was used for economic administration over a geographical area in Hellenistic Egypt. The bishops of dioceses, in turn, were increasingly coordinated in their efforts by the bishops of major metropolitan sees, not incidentally also important imperial cities that came to be called patriarchates: Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and symbolically Jerusalem. As the imperial city par excellence, the church in Rome asserted and exercised the most influence on other regions. Rome's authority in the 2nd and 3rd century was far from absolute. As we have already seen, the bishops of Asia simply resist the efforts of Victor I of Rome to impose his ruling in the Easter controversy around the year 190. Yet, the symbolic and moral authority of the Roman Church is real, based not only on the fact of being the imperial capital. Writers at the turn of the 1st century make much of the fact that Rome was doubly blessed in its apostolic founding. Both Peter and Paul were martyred there. And we remember that Irenaeus, bishop of far-off Lyon in Gaul, makes his point against the Gnostics about apostolic succession by enumerating the bishops of Rome, from Peter to his own day. In the next century, these centers of regional ecclesial authority will begin to express themselves through theological and political rivalries. And with the founding of Constantinople, a real rival to Roman primacy will assert itself. So in terms of sheer numbers, in terms of visibility, in terms of social standing, in terms of ideological and institutional development, the Christian religion was, by the beginnings of the 4th century, no longer an insignificant sect to be easily dismissed by authorities. It had become a force to be reckoned with by the empire. And in the next lecture, we will see the development as well during this period of an intellectual self-confidence through the beginnings of Christian philosophy.
You want the lights on?
Yeah. Did you get all that?
Are you kidding me? Holy cow.
Sonia, there's one on the pillar right there, and then the other one's over by the doorway over there. So here's my perception of most Christians, and that is, we know an awful lot about the beginning of Christianity because we study the New Testament, and then for Lutherans particularly, we know an awful lot about, the year 1500, 1517, something like that, and then all of the 1500 years in between is just sort of out there, right? And we don't really have a good grasp of how Christianity actually develops and takes on the contours that it does. First of all, let me ask you, based upon what you saw, do you have any specific questions, anything that you want to bring up or just talk about a little bit more? Yeah.
Well, it seemed like he was saying that the church in Paul's time sort of had this secular-based leadership, and that notions of more kind of divinely inspired leadership occurred later. But it seems to me that in the scriptures it's pretty clear about at least Paul having a notion of an apostolic role that is ordained ordained, or whatever you want to call it, by Christ himself. So I was confused with what he was saying there.
Okay. That's a really good point. I would go back and if you look at Paul's letters, for instance, one of the most refreshing things about Paul is that, and this is one of the reasons that historians and scholars believe that Paul was so successful in spreading Christianity, is that he insists that there is equality before God. You know, and there's that famous passage. He says before God, he says there's neither male nor female, there's neither Jew nor Greek, that we're all equal. And in many of his writings, as he goes out and founds these various Christian communities, and then he communicates with them, he sort of spreads it around. Frequently, he'll be talking to women. You know, he'll be addressing women, or he'll say, "Give my regards to this particular woman who is a leader among you." And it's there's Paul actually, if you look at that wonderful 15th chapter of the book of Acts. He goes face to face with both Peter and James in Jerusalem, who are arguing, as a matter of fact, that to be a follower of Jesus, what you have to do is literally you have to be a Jew. You have to be a good Jew. You have to attend to all of the rituals and all of the ceremonies. You have to have the priest sacrifice for you and these sorts of things, and you have to observe clean and unclean. And Paul says, no, none of that stuff matters. What really matters is that you have to have faith. And if you have faith in Jesus, what do you have to have faith in? That this man that we know as Jesus was actually sent by God. He was God's son, and he is the anointed one. That is, he's the Christ that we've been waiting for, right? And so he actually challenges that notion of priestly hierarchy right there. Paul does. And you tend to, if you look at the literature of the early days of Christianity, there tends to be a lot of room for women in high places in these early Christian communities. This is one of the things, boy, when we get to Constantine, you're going to see that change big time, right? Because what happens is Christianity goes from being sort of this tolerated fringe religion over there, which, you know, you really don't want your sons to get too involved, particularly if you want them to have a good career, to all of a sudden, if your son becomes a bishop, he's going to have enormous power and he's going to have enormous influence and quite a bit of wealth, right? These positions become highly, highly sought after among the Roman, particularly among the Roman aristocracy, at which point they start reading women right out of the church, right? This changes enormously when Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome. So I would qualify that notion that what he's trying to what he is talking about is actually that in the early days of Christianity, and Paul talks about this as well. When you come together, what he says is that we are going to do two things. We are going to celebrate the feast of the Agape, right? And why we've done away with this, I have no idea. Well, I do know, but we won't talk about it. Because it turned into too much drinking. Let's just leave it there. But the Feast of the Agape, we're going to celebrate, right? It's a feast of shared love among Christians. This is what we're going to do. And then after we do that, we are going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And there's absolutely no strictures whatsoever, or no prescriptions about who or who cannot lead the celebration of the Lord's Supper, right, in Paul's letters. It's open to everybody, and any Christian presumably then can lead in the ceremony of the Lord's Supper. This only becomes hierarchical as that priesthood begins to develop later on in the second and third centuries.
Well, though it seems to me, for example, that Paul takes pains to justify his own apostleship.
Yeah.
And he stresses at least in regards to Timothy, the importance of the laying on of the hands as part of the ritual for kind of bestowing apostolic whatever upon Timothy in regards to his leadership. So I fully agree with you in regards to sort of the egalitarian aspect, but it just seems to me the notion that there was no sort of divine aspect to it.
Yeah, I see what you're
seems
saying.
a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, here's the problem. If you were Paul, here's the problem, right? You have 11 men. We're not talking. We won't count Judas Iscariot anymore. But you've got 11 men, the apostles of Christ, who walked with Christ for 3 years, who were deeply involved in his ministry, who listened to Christ talk about and preach, right? Talk about salvation and God and these sorts of things. And they are then apparently the direct heirs of Jesus after he is crucified and is resurrected and ascends into heaven. And then here comes Paul, who, number one, never clapped eyes on Jesus at all, right? And secondly, Paul says, you guys have got it all wrong. I really understand what salvation is all about. You don't have to do what you're doing. All you have to do is have faith. You see, there's a problem right there, if you were Paul, right? And Paul claims then, he says, I literally saw Christ, right on the road to Damascus, where Christ appears to him and says, Saul, Saul, what are you doing? Why are you persecuting me? And at this point, he has a conversion experience. And this is why he has to emphasize, right, that I have, in fact, been divinely touched by God. Because there's a huge problem right there in the early church. Who are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to Peter and James down there in Jerusalem who say, you have to be a Jew? Or are you going to listen to Paul who says, well, if you're Jewish, that's all right, but really, all you really have to do is have faith, and this opens up to the Gentiles as well. So there is this tradition, and we find this also, this comes right out of Judaism as well, where there are rabbinical traditions, there are teachers, right? And you follow then the authority of a certain rabbi with his particular interpretation. And this is what Paul is laying claim to, right? Yeah. But as far as being priests, no, they don't claim to, Paul doesn't claim to be a priest, right? But this divine inspiration, yeah. Yes, please, huh?
The thing that stood out to me is when he likened the whole Mooney thing to
early Christianity.
That's kind of how and you think of the Moonies as being like, some weird cult.
Mooney. They're kind of Mooney.
Huh?
I said they're kind of Mooney.
Yeah. And yet he kind of attributes the growth of Christianity to that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's right.
Moonies are.
What are the Moonies? I don't know. They're a cult. I think they originate out in California, like all weird stuff.
I think they came out of Korea.
Oh, really?
The Unification Church.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know anything about them, but I'll tell you the point that he's trying to make, and I agree with it completely. And that is, there are, in order to sum up and make sense out of what he's talking about, here's the development of early Christianity to begin with. And one of the things he doesn't address, which I wish he would have, because he goes, he says in the year 40 there are probably about 1,000 Christians. Right? 1,000 Christians. Okay. And then by the year, I think he says by the year 250 there are something like 6 million Christians. Right? And he never addresses why. Why would anyone want to become a Christian? And why is this exponential growth of Christianity?
And how do they know that?
Yeah.
How can he say that?
What's that?
How can he say those numbers? What evidence is there?
That's a really good question, and I don't know what he's basing that on, but I would assume probably the demographic studies of the spread of literature, the Christian writings, and people looking at the records of bishops and bishoprics and things like that. He's ballparking. He says we don't know this. Yeah. But here's the important thing. Okay, so the question is, why does Christianity go from being this tiny little sect in Jerusalem and in Palestine to, by the year 250, having about 6 million members? Okay, and and here's where the analogy to the Moonies come in, and that is most scholars agree that Christianity was successful initially because of the tremendous sense of community that it offered to its followers. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we had church history when I was in high school in Norway, and one of the things that I remember that they stressed, the difference between pre-Constantine and after Constantine, was the terrible persecution that Christians had experienced before Constantine, and that this was a radical change and a wonderful thing.
Yeah, he tends to downplay that a little bit.
Yes, I noticed that, and I wonder why.
Well, he says it was, rather than being a consistent thing, it was more sporadic, which I can go along with. Now, one of the things you have to remember is, but I'll get back to the spread of Christianity in a minute. We know the catacombs, for instance, the catacombs on the outside of Rome, right? They're not more than 2 or 3 miles outside of Rome, something like this. They're huge, and everyone knew about them. As a matter of fact, the Christians were permitted to bury their dead there. They were permitted to worship there, and this does not go go on if you're being bitterly persecuted by the Roman emperors, right? They didn't go there to hide out. They went there to have services and to bury their dead and to be with their dead. And so the idea then that they're just consistently being persecuted simply doesn't hold up. But on the other hand, one of the things about persecution is in these years from maybe 150 down to about 250 or so, it winnowed out the weak of faith, right? You didn't lightly choose to become a Christian because there was in fact a price to pay if you're going to become a Christian here. And this is one of the reasons why Christianity manages to hang on, because you get these people who are just very, very sincere about their faith. So while I wouldn't just sweep away the idea of these persecutions because they're very real, they're more sporadic, I think, than we would tend to believe. But let me get back. Okay, just to make sense out of what he's talking about, there are three things about Christianity. First of all, why does it spread a sense of community, right? And you look at in the gospel, or not the gospel, but the book of Acts, and the book of Acts says they are living together in a community. They are eating together. They are sharing all of their wealth together. They look after one another, right? They provide help for the poor and for the sick and for the lame. They look after the widows. And this is no doubt one of the major reasons, one of the major attractions of early Christianity, right? That these people looked after one another. Plus, they had a notion that there was, in fact, if you were a follower of Jesus, there was going to be a better life in the next world to come, right? So you're looking after each other in this world. You're treating all with a tremendous sense of respect because of this egalitarian notion of Christianity. There is hope for you in the afterlife as well. And there is hope for you in this life because these people believe ferociously in the power of prayer. Right? And so this notion of community, I think, is one of the reasons why Christianity takes off. The second problem with Christianity is, and this is, I'm not knocking Jesus here, but this is the problem. Jesus was obviously enormously charismatic. He was an inspired teacher. He was an inspired rabbi. How do you bottle that and pass it on? You see the problem? You see the problem right here? How do you bottle that and pass it on? And somehow, that's what the second and third generations Christians had to do. How do you keep the momentum going? How do you keep the teachings of the Master? How do you keep his love and his sense of passion alive? And somewhere along the line, you've got to start having a body of doctrines and a body of teaching that everybody can agree on, that you can pass down one from the other. Well, how does that come about? You need people to do that. You need leaders. You need leadership, and then you need people to start teaching other people this is what we believe, right? And so you've got this sense of community that develops, and that helps to explain the spread. And then you've got the establishment of teachings, and then you have to have some way then to begin to pass this on down. And then your community begins to grow. It begins to attract followers. It gets larger and larger, and slowly, piece by piece, people within your community and various assemblies and communities begin to have some wealth. What do you do with that wealth? Well, you need to look after the poor, you need to look after the widows, and you need to look after those who are struggling, and you need to support others. And this then calls for further institutionalization as well. You see how this happens? And this is what he's talking about right here. This is really it grows by starts and fits. There's not sort of a steady development here, but rather, you get these communities, they start to grow, and you get the teaching, and you need some sort of institution to pass on, not just the teachings, but to help you look after one another. And he points to Ignatius of Antioch in the year 150 or 170, who is all for the bishops. We need somebody to take charge of all of this. It's just getting too complicated to have part-time administrators do this sort of stuff, right? Can you imagine what Zion would be like if it was just us and there wasn't Pastor Vicky and Pastor Jim? Think about that. I mean, this is what they're facing, really. I mean, you got to have somebody in charge. That's all there is to it. And this is what, as it becomes more textured, and it becomes a little bit wealthier in larger numbers, these institutional forces have to take over if this is going to be managed. That's all there is to it. Yeah. Okay, we've got time for maybe one more question, and we'll stop. Yeah, right.
So, in his discussion about Christianity not growing by big conversions,
yeah.
He talks about there being no historical evidence for big conversion.
Outside of the Acts of the Apostles, I think.
Well, but so that then is my question. He he seems to be discounting Scripture as a historical artifact.
Did any of you pick up? He called them the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah. Yeah. What was?
Yeah. I would kind of disagree with that. I think, although there could be some embellishing going on in the Acts of the Apostles. But at the same time, well, one of the things we know is, for instance, if you read the accounts of battles in the ancient world, the armies are about 3 million men apiece, right? They're just huge. They're huge beyond all belief. And so we may get a little bit of hyperbole when it comes to the number of people who are actually, witnessing miracles and converted. But I wouldn't doubt that if the apostles are going out and if they are working miracles, that this is in fact going to lead people to say, your God is absolutely powerful, and so we will start worshiping your God. This happens all across the ancient world all the time, right? That these priests, the priests of these various gods, have to prove that their gods have the power to work miracles. Otherwise, you're going to find another God who can do that. And so I have no doubt that this is what the apostles are doing. How large were the groups of people that were converted? We have no idea. But again, the idea of hyperbole, a group converted, so maybe there were 3,000. Well, who knows?
Well, Pentecost, it talks about 5,000.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, we don't know what the number was. Even if it was 250, that's huge.
Right.
It is, yeah. But I would say, rather than these mass conversions as Christianity goes along, rather than mass conversions based upon miracles, I think much more solid. We're on much safer ground when we understand, and this is what he's talking about, the social relationships, the social networking that these Christians carried out to support and help one another, right? The community of believers. I think that's a powerful, powerful force in this Roman world. Okay, we're going to have to stop here. I hope you come next week, because we'll have another really good video and a little bit more about the development of Christianity's crucial years.